Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope you're all doing well. Happy Sunday. I did intend to do this live stream yesterday, but time kind of got away with me and I got a little bit lazy. So here I am on a Sunday to talk about the Karen Reid case. Now, in my last live stream, which was Friday, I said that I was going to go back and listen to what the medics said in trial 1. Particularly Dr. Stonebridge, who was the neuropathologist who actually got her hands on John O'Keefe's brain. So unlike the neurosurgeon, however well qualified he is, he didn't actually get his hands on John O'Keefe's brain. You know, the Dr. Wolfe, the brain surgeon that Hank called. And I thought, well, why did he not call Stonebridge? So I went back and listened to Stonebridge's testimony. And it's not long, it's only half an hour. So we're going to play that. But I also went back and listened to Scotty Bello from trial 1. So the same medical examiner that was called in trial 2. So she did the actual autopsy. She was the one who sent the brain to Dr. Stonebridge for more of an expert opinion. And Scotty Bello didn't really say anything different than she did in trial 2. However, she talked more about the brain and she actually showed some diagrams, which I thought were really useful. So I don't know why Scotty Bello was not allowed. Like, Bev stopped it. I don't know why. Unless he wasn't allowed to cross-examine her on the brain, there was nothing that she said that was devastating to the Commonwealth. So I'm still left with a massive question mark as to what actually went down in trial 2. You know, we're not privy to the sidebars or anything, are we? So it's impossible to tell. But neither Scotty Bello nor Stonebridge said anything that was absolutely devastating to the Commonwealth's case, but nor did they say anything that was devastating to the defence case either. So I don't know. But then again, Dr. Wolfe, the brain surgeon, also said some stuff that was supportive of the Commonwealth's case. You know, that when he worked in Minnesota, where it was cold, because he'd been in Florida for many years, but where it was cold, they used to see a lot of fractured skulls and head injuries caused by drunk people falling over. So that's wholly consistent with the defence case. If the defence is saying, well, the injury could have happened in any other way other than Karen knocking him over with her vehicle. So we're going to listen to Stonebridge. I'm going to show you these diagrams that Scotty Bello did. And they're autopsy diagrams, but the jury would have been I think it would have been so useful to the jury, because in trial 2, Dr. Wolfe, as I said when I reviewed Dr. Wolfe's testimony, it's impossible for somebody who doesn't know anything about brain anatomy to visualize what Dr. Wolfe was talking about. And it would have been beneficial for him to bring diagrams or a model or something to show the jury. Just helpful to them to know whereabouts in the brain this thing was going on. And I know it kind of explained, but unless you have an understanding of brain anatomy to begin with, it's all a bit vague in a word. So that's what we're going to be doing. Let's say a couple of hellos first. Hello, CW. I know. I saw that as well. Harmony Montgomery's birth mother, Crystal Sorey, got a $2 million payout. Yeah. She sued the state for Harmony being put back with Adam. And what price someone's life? $2 million is a lot, but what price someone's life? Hopefully she uses it for good and she doesn't go back down a druggy path. Hopefully she, good luck to her. Hopefully she uses it well. Hello down under with love, Jennifer Arias, windy weather. It is windy weather here as well. Windy weather at winter. It's windy weather, very windy here today. Hola, hello, Sassy Gigi, Jackie, Lisa Marie, The Quiet Observer, Emeralda, Kelly, Kimberly, Two Arctic Wolves, Marie, Navin, phone temperature. You have to consider everything. If you fell over, it had to be outside and around 12:32 and by the flagpole. Not by the flagpole, no, not by the flagpole. Remember, John's phone walked 83.5 feet, 36 steps in a westerly direction once he left that vehicle, between 12:31 and 56 seconds and 12:32 and 16 seconds. So no, by the time that phone stopped and by the time that phone started to lose heat, he was 83.5 feet away from where he got out of the vehicle. So all of the guilters are forgetting that, including Shannon Burgess. He wouldn't talk about it either. So yes, you do have to consider everything. You are quite right. You are quite right. And 83.5 feet away from the curb would put him in the backyard. So yes, maybe he was outside the whole time. But not near the flagpole, though. Hello, Melissa, Alina, Patrice. And we got Kamiyumi, maybe, from Melbourne, Australia, and Roxanne. The westerly direction was GPS drift and only lasted 4 seconds. Okay, well, explain the 83.5 feet then. All right, explain that. Explain that. Okay. Okay, without further ado, let's actually, first of all, we'll make the screen bigger. Let's look at these diagrams first of all. So I'm not going to play a testimony here, but that's the actual autopsy diagram. So let me do it this way. Not that it's easy to read, but this is the diagram that she did during the autopsy itself. Which makes more sense than looking at a blank one. But this diagram here, not this one, there's another one, better one. So we've got 0.8 centimeter laceration here. This laceration is interesting. But this shows the actual fracture lines. Now, I thought that this would be really useful for the jury. The fracture lines. So this is the back of the brain, obviously. And then you've got this, it's only an inch or so that can be seen visually on the outside, laceration. But these were the fracture lines. And you're looking down. So if you take the brain out and then you look down onto the bones that form the base of the skull, like a bowl that the brain sits in, That's what you're looking at. You're looking downward. So this is where his eyes will be. So you can see that from this laceration, you've got these fracture lines up the occipital fossa to the middle. And that's the foramen magnum, the hole where the spinal cord comes through. And then you've got some fracture lines on the temporal fossa, which is on the side. And then you've got the fracture lines that go all the way through to the anterior fossa. Now, this bone here, the anterior fossa, is really thin. It's like the one that ends, kind of forms, I guess, your brow ridge kind of thing, like those, that's like right behind your eyes. So on the occipital roof, he's got fracture lines, and that's why you got raccoon eyes, because you've got, as well as the fractures, you've got some of the blood vessels being burst, and obviously that causes bleeding. So it shows just how devastating this injury was. Devastating. So the jury needed that. I thought that was really, really useful, because it explains exactly where the fractures were. So why they weren't shown that, I don't know. I do not know. Do not know. Do not know. All right, let's listen to Dr. Stonebridge. So it's only half an hour. We're going to listen to it all. And this is trial 1, Adam Lally. And then, spoiler alert, there's absolutely zero cross-examination. Why she wasn't cross-examined, I don't know. Maybe the defence thought that she'd said enough. I mean, remember, Alessi's cross-examination of Dr. Wolfe was only very short, but there was zero cross-examination of Dr. Stonebridge. So they probably thought she's said enough to support our case. We don't need to cross-examine her. Check Bev says, checking out Stonebridge. Bev has a very expressive face when it comes to witnesses when they're sitting down. Look at Bev's face when she checks out the other Dr. Wolfe. The other Dr. Wolfe, the Wolfe with an E from Arca. Go and play back that testimony from trial 1 and watch her as he sits down. She proper checks him out up and down. It's the funniest thing I've ever seen, I think. I've been back and listened to Arca's testimony. While I was being lazy yesterday, I listened to Arca's testimony. So Dr. Wolfe and Dr. What's his name? The other one, Reichler, is it? Reichler. I listened to that yesterday. All right, let's play this. I'll stop it at points. I'll play it from the beginning. He talks a bit about education, a bit about pathology, neuropathology, and then he gets into John in about nearly 8 minutes.
Want to keep our air conditioning on, so just if you'd speak loudly into the microphone, that would be great. Yes, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Lally.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Could you please state your name and spell your last name for the jury?
Yes, my name is Renee Stonebridge. Last name Stonebridge, Stonebridge.
And what do you do for work?
I am employed through the Chief Medical Examiner's Office at Boston.
Rentschler, thank you. That sounds right. Rentschler, not Reichler. She did almost drool over Dr. Wolfe. She did.
Boston as Director of Cardiac and Neuropathology and Medical Examiner.
Now, if I could ask you just a few questions about sort of your educational and work history background, if that's all right.
Yes.
Starting with your bachelor's degree, where did you go and what, if any, area did you receive a degree in?
So I went to SUNY at Stony Brook in New York. I was a double major in biology and Germanic languages and literature. I graduated with a bachelor's of science degree. After that, I went to the American University of Antigua for medical school, and I graduated with honors, magna cum laude. After that, I did a 4-year combined anatomic and clinical pathology residency program at NYU Winthrop Hospital in Long Island, New York. After that, I did a 1-year forensic pathology fellowship at the Boston office of the chief medical examiner. And after that, I did a 2-year neuropathology fellowship program through Brown University at Rhode Island Hospital.
And doctor, are you board certified?
Yes, I am board certified in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, forensic pathology, and neuropathology.
And if you could just explain to the jury a little bit about what does board certified mean?
Board certification means that every medical specialty has their own board. So for example, the American Board of Pathology dictates whether or not you can be board certified based on certain criteria. So you have to meet certain criteria, meaning that you have to complete a certain number of surgical specimens, a certain number of autopsies. And then once you meet that criteria, you can take an exam, which if you pass, leads to your board certification.
Now, if I could ask you just a couple, and your board certification is up to date at this point, is that correct?
Yes.
In each of those areas that you just spoke of?
Yes.
Now, if I could ask you some general terms as far as if you could define them for the jury. First of all, what is pathology in a general sense?
Pathology is essentially the study of any sort of disease or abnormal state of the body tissues. So anything that can go wrong in the body and any of the body systems is essentially the study of pathology.
And now starting with anatomic pathology, what is anatomic pathology more specifically?
Anatomic pathology consists of the study of surgical specimens. So for example, if someone goes to the hospital to have a tumor removed, that specimen will go to pathology. The pathologist will look at it, cut it, look at specimens under the microscope, order any ancillary tests if necessary, and then make a diagnosis, which is then conveyed to the clinician. Anatomic pathology also consists of cytopathology, which is looking at individual cells. And then it also consists of autopsy pathology.
And as far as clinical pathology, what does that mean?
Clinical pathology is anything that is lab related in pathology. So if you have to get blood drawn and then the results come back, that is clinical pathology. If there's any sort of blood work that needs to be done, for example, if you're going to have a surgery and they have to cross match and type you in case of a blood transfusion, that's considered clinical pathology. Also microbiology, so anything infectious. So essentially anything that goes through a lab is clinical pathology.
And what is forensic pathology?
Forensic pathology is the study of autopsies in a medical legal sense. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be something that is legal. Sometimes it may be just a person who has not seen a doctor in many years, dies at home. There's no physician that is willing to sign a death certificate. So we work on those types of cases, plus anything that is non-natural.
Now, neuropathology, what is that?
Neuropathology is the study of the brain, spinal cord, eyes, muscles, and nerves.
And if you could, just again, in general terms, as far as casework is concerned, related to your work as a director of the neuropathology, can you explain to the jury sort of what it is that you do with respect to neuropathology?
Yes. So my job primarily entails me to be a consultant for the medical examiners. So the medical examiners have a certain set of criteria that they follow in order to determine whether or not a brain needs to be saved for a neuropathologic analysis. So upon following that criteria, if the brain is saved, it gets put into formalin, which essentially fixes the brain so it firms it up, so it makes it easier to analyze. So after the brain has been fixed, I usually let them fix about 2 weeks. Sometimes it could be a little more, a little less, depending on circumstances. I will then look at the brain, take photographs of it from all sides, and then cut the brain, take photographs, document any sort of abnormalities. And then if I feel the need to take sections to look at under the microscope, then I will take those sections. They will be processed through histology. I will look at the slides. Sometimes you may have to add in additional testing, for example, immunohistochemistry, to see if there's anything in particular that you cannot maybe diagnose solely on looking at the histology. And then once that is done, I will issue a report to the medical examiner, and then they use it in terms of determining their cause and manner of death, if necessary.
Now, as far as that formalin process, as far as the solution is concerned, is there?
So again, she actually did this. She's the one that did this. Dr. Wolf, however well qualified he is, he only saw the results of Stonebridge's work. He didn't get his hands on the brain. He didn't order whatever tests were needed. He just looked at the after results. Now, how much that mattered, I don't know. But I think to the jury, it's more impressive to have on the stand the person that actually did the work rather than the person who just reviewed it. I don't know. Like, as a juror, I'd have preferred to listen to her than listen to the other guy. So it's interesting why Hank hasn't called her. It's very interesting.
A typical time period that the brain would have to be in that solution prior to you examining it or cutting it or any of those other things?
Usually about 2 weeks, give or take maybe a few days here and there, but I usually try to let them fix at least 10 days minimum.
And again, in general terms, with respect to the types of cases that are referred to you, what types of cases are typically referred to you?
So part of the criteria that we use is that any cases for children or babies under the age of 2 years, those always come to me. Also, if there is any cases that have blunt head trauma that may be suspicious or homicidal in nature, those will typically come to me as well. Some of the other cases may be just a difficult neuropathologic entity that a non-neuropath trained medical examiner may not be able to really diagnose. And then sometimes there's cases that are just surprise cases where the medical examiner opens up the head and they see something interesting or abnormal and they decide to save that case for me to look at further.
So that's what Scotty Bello did. Like, she saw those fractures in the bones at the base of his brain and thought, oh, you know, I need an expert neuro consultant here. So that's what she did. She saved the brain, put the brain in formalin and sent it to Dr. Stonebridge.
Now, with respect to the cases that you do see, at some point did you become involved in analysis or testing of a brain belonging to John O'Keefe?
Yes.
And who was the doctor that was the medical examiner that made that referral in this case?
It was Dr. Irini Scordi-Bello.
And with respect to your analysis here, obviously you looked at the brain. What, if any, other sources of information did you review or did you look at in ultimately formulating your opinion in this case?
So at the time when I was able to cut the brain of Mr. O'Keefe, I had information that was relayed to us from our intake department. So when a case gets called into the medical examiner, it gets taken by the intake department and they're given kind of just a rough summary of the case. I also had the police report, I had the EMS report, I had the medical records from when Mr. O'Keefe was in the hospital. I also had medical records from the primary care physician. I had autopsy photos, and I also had, I believe just refer to my notes here because I had a lot of notes. I also had the inventory and tracking sheets, which are notes created by the medical examiner, and the neuropath request itself.
Now, are you familiar with some terms in relation to injuries that you would observe as far as from a neuropathological perspective, as far as injuries being acute, subacute, or remote?
Yes.
And can you explain to the jury sort of what those are and what those mean?
So it depends on circumstances. Acute generally is something that happened within a very short time frame. So when I refer to something as being acute, I usually refer to that as something that's occurring from the time of an injury to maybe a day or so afterwards. As I said, it's variable dependent on circumstances. Subacute is something that has not happened within the last few minutes, few hours, maybe even a day, and maybe something that is now in the process of healing. And then chronic is usually something that has happened a while ago in the past. You may see some sort of evidence of some type of injury in a chronic state. You may also not see any evidence because it may have completely healed by that point.
And so from your analysis in this case, how did you characterize, in your opinion, from everything that you reviewed as far as the injuries you observed in Mr. O'Keefe's brain?
The injuries I observed were acute injuries, meaning that they probably occurred minutes to hours.
So not something that he had previously, for example. You know, it is possible for somebody to have an injury that no one knows about, or a disease process that no one knows about. They die, and then it gets discovered at autopsy. So it's for the medics to discern whether that process that was already in occurrence, whether that contributed to the death or not. So let's say, for example, in John O'Keefe's case, let's say he'd had I'm just making stuff up now, but let's just a hypothetical scenario. Let's say he had a minor stroke, like, I don't know, a week previous, before he died. And he wasn't aware of it, because you can have minor strokes in your sleep and you're not aware of it. Well, there wouldn't be evidence of it in his brain, though. So that would then be very carefully considered as to whether that stroke activity that had happened the week before contributed to his death. And if he's on the autopsy slab with a massive head injury like John had, so fractured skull, then it would be a big question mark as to whether the stroke activity that had happened the week before was a contributor to how he came to have a fractured skull. So you'd have a subacute disease process, and then you'd have an acute injury. So that would be really interesting. That would be really hotly debated in the event of a court case. As it is, John didn't have any other injuries to his brain or disease processes in his brain. So the only thing that they had to consider was the skull fractures and how he came to get them.
Now, if I could turn your attention to your findings as far as when you conducted your analysis and your testing in this particular case, what, if anything, did you find as far as injuries to Mr. O'Keefe's brain?
So when I look at the brain, what I do is I look at all surfaces from all sides. And one of the things that I look for is anything grossly obvious, meaning anything I can look at the brain and see that there's something there that shouldn't be there. So one of the first things I noticed was a subarachnoid hemorrhage. And subarachnoid hemorrhage is something that occurs when you have bleeding within the leptomeninges. The leptomeninges are a very thin membrane that encase the brain and the spinal cord, and there should not be blood freely floating within the leptomeninges. So if you have a subarachnoid,
so you'll know meningitis. You'll know the name meningitis, won't you? So meningitis is inflammation of the meninges, i.e. the membranes of the brain.
Hemorrhage, most of the time the causes are either a ruptured aneurysm, which is something I would see upon cutting the brain, or some type of trauma. So that was the first finding.
Can I stop you there just for a second? Of those taking notes and for our court reporter, could you spell the type of hemorrhage and the membrane?
Yes. Subarachnoid is SUBARACHNOID. And leptomeninges, LEPTOMENINGES.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Now, with regard to anything related to the aneurysm that you indicated that you would have seen, what, if anything, did you see during the course of your review or testing or analysis of Mr. O'Keefe's brain?
So aneurysms are typically seen in the cerebral vessels that sit around the base of the brain. So there's something called the circle of Willis, which is the main arterial supply. It sits around the base of the brain, and it's kind of shaped like a circle that has vessels that come off that extend to other areas of the brain. So typically, if there is an aneurysm that is ruptured, it's going to be located somewhere in one of those vessels. So upon observing those vessels, I did not see any evidence of any aneurysm or any sort of natural disease state that might have led to a rupture in one of these vessels. Also,
there you go. So that's what she investigated. Was there a natural disease state that could have preempted or caused the skull fracture? So if he'd had an aneurysm and he'd fallen because of his aneurysm, could he then have cracked his head and got a skull fracture? That kind of thing. So I used the example of a mini stroke that you might have had in your sleep and not be aware of. But she checked out whether he'd had an aneurysm, and no sign, basically no sign of disease in his brain at all. So the only thing they had to consider was the skull fracture and the results of that skull fracture.
sometimes these vessels, since they do go deep into the brain, you may only see the rupture upon cutting the brain. And I did not see any evidence of any rupture of any of these vessels anywhere in the brain.
Now, as far as the subarachnoid hemorrhage that you observed, where was that located within the brain, if you could?
So the subarachnoid hemorrhage was on the frontal poles, which is essentially right here in the front of the brain. So the frontal lobes obviously sit in the front, and then the poles are the very frontmost portion of the brain. So it was on the frontal poles.
So if we look at this very useful diagram that Dr. Scordi-Bello made, you're looking here, right at the front of the brain. So that's where you're seeing the hemorrhaging. So as the back of the head strikes whatever it struck, whether it be the ground, whether it be a wall, whether it be something else, it's kind of sent the brain forward. It's basically, I picture it as something like you've got these radiating fractures that it's like a crumple kind, not quite, but that force sends that brain forward, smacks it against the bones here, and that entire process causes the brain, the blood vessels at the front of the brain here to burst. And then you get the bleeding. The blood can't go anywhere. It ends up behind the eyes, and that's how you get the raccoon eyes.
It was also on the left temporal pole. So the temporal region is right here in the temporal region. And because of the way that the temporal lobe is shaped, it kind of has a little loop right in the front. So it has a pole as well. So it was on the left temporal pole. And then it was also in the left lateral fissure. So
which is really interesting. Again, so this is left, this is right. You've got some fracturing. You've got a little bit more fracturing to the right. So this is the right temporal, but the bleeding was on the left. So it's kind of like he hit the back of his head, but more to the right. So it's caused the fractures here, and it's caused a ricochet over here. It's interesting. And you just don't get that detail when Dr. Wolf described it, because you don't have the diagram to help you work, you know, to visualize. So, I don't know. Potentially Hank could have made a mistake. Maybe. I don't know.
You have the temporal lobe right here, and then the lateral fissure goes kind of in between the temporal and the frontal lobes. So you have the hemorrhage here, and then hemorrhage right there. So it's kind of all concentrated almost in one area. But then there was also hemorrhage of the posterior surface of the right temporal as well. So on this side.
Now, doctor, I'm probably going to butcher this horribly, but just as far as a bilateral unci, are you familiar with that?
Yes. So the unci are the medial portion.
The fractures don't join up. Doesn't that mean multiple blows to the head? Not necessarily, because the bones at the base of the brain, so the bowl that the brain sits in, are very thin. So it can radiate fractures out. Right-handed jabs, left-handed punches. You'd have to be punched really hard to get a fractured skull just from punches. Now, if somebody smacked your head against the wall repeatedly, that could create skull fractures in various parts of the brain. But it's perfectly feasible for just one strike to have caused all of that. It really is. Because it's the force. It's not just the smack to the back of the head. It's the force of the brain moving. But I do think there's some kind of right-handed thing going on here. Like, to create the bleeding over here, I could be persuaded that he smacked his head and that caused the back injury, so the laceration that you could see on the outside. But then there was a further smack to his right side, which created the brain bleed over here. I could be persuaded that that happened. And the right-handed force wasn't as maybe heavy and didn't actually cause any laceration. You probably would see some bruising though. This is the thing. Like if he'd been smacked on the right side of his head, even if it didn't cause a laceration, i.e. a cut, I'm sure it would, to create a fracture, would have been strong enough to create bruising on the outside. So while it's technically possible, I don't think it's probable because there's no bruising on this side. So I think it was one, but slightly more to the right than the left, because you've got the fracture to the right, but then you've got the bleeding to the left. I think the strike may have been like here. Because if this diagram is perfect, like perfectly explain the fractures, you've got the fractures leaning this way. You've got these two fractures leaning this way. And you've got them leaning this way. So if the strike was here, that would have made sense. Because it radiates the fractures this way. And the bleeding this way. So that makes more sense than repeated strikes. Repeated strikes would have caused, I think, more external injuries. Even if it's just bruising, that demonstrates where the strikes were on the outside. So although you could persuade me that there might be a way to strike him to the side of the head that would cause a fracture but wouldn't cause external bruising, I would say it's highly improbable. Highly improbable. I think it's one strike. I think the strike's here. And the brain's gone whoop, like that. Because you've also got more fracture on this side. So the brain's gone whoop, this way. Like that. That's where he got bleeding on the left. Now, I wouldn't have picked that up at all. From Dr. Wolf's testimony, could not have picked that up at all. It's seeing this diagram that makes it quite clear what most likely happened.
Of the temporal lobes. So the brain is essentially oriented in a way that each hemisphere, the right and left.
Of course, just because the skull fractures weren't caused by him being beaten up doesn't mean they were caused by him being struck by a vehicle. Because his injuries have no consistency whatsoever of being struck by a vehicle. The injury to his head is characteristic of falling, but as Dr. Wolf said, to Hank's detriment, there's many ways that someone can fall, hit their head, and end up dying from a fractured skull. Being drunk, for example. Could he have been pushed and fell backwards? Yes. Could he have been punched and fell backwards? Yes. Could he have fallen over of his own, on his own? Yes. None of it leads to a diagnosis of being struck by a vehicle. That's why Scotty Bello did not term his death a homicide. She didn't know. It could have been anything. It could have been the result of a homicide, or it could have been a complete accident. He could have done it himself. He could have fallen over and done it himself. Now, the thing that leads me to believe that he didn't do it himself is because he had dog bites all down his right arm. Not dog bites. Have you ever been bit by a dog? Have you ever seen dog bites? If you've never seen dog bites before, just take a look at John O'Keefe's right arm, and there you have dog bites. Thank you.
Left hemisphere are the same. The unsi are the most inner portion of the temporal lobes. So the unsi sit just next to the brainstem. So if you have anything that causes herniation of these unsi, they start to push inwards onto the brainstem. So say this is a brainstem, here the unsi, they start to push in. And because the brain is within the skull is hard, you have no room for any sort of expansion of the brain. If there is herniation, it will start to push in that area because the brainstem turns into the spinal cord and goes out of the skull through the foramen magnum. So you have this hole about this big or so at the base of the skull where the brainstem turns to the spinal cord, then comes out. So that's one of the only areas in which the brain can actually move because it's encased in the hard skull. So if you have herniation, it'll start to push and then push downwards.
Yeah, I've got herniation. It's called Chiari malformation. My brain is herniated in through my foramen magnum, and a bit of my brain, 0.7 centimeters of my brain, is actually in my spine. It's bizarre. It's bizarre. But there you go.
Could I ask you to spell unsi?
UNCI.
And with reference to this bilateral unsi area, what, if any, herniation did you observe?
So when the unsi herniate, it can be subtle. Sometimes if it's herniated enough, you may see hemorrhages in the brainstem. And this happens because this tissue is now pushing on the brainstem and it's essentially being compressed. So there was herniation noted, and then there was hemorrhage within the brainstem.
Now, if I could ask you, Doctor, just to be familiar with the term or medical term known as a contusion.
Yes.
And can you explain just in general terms to the jury what you understand that term to mean?
So a contusion is essentially...
No, that's not true. The pig DNA was on his shirt or his hoodie. The arm was not swabbed at all. The arm was not swabbed at all. So the testing for animal DNA was done only on the shirt. And the shirt didn't show any dog DNA, but it did show pig DNA. Do you know what I think? I think he ate something pig-related. I think at some point that day, he'd had something pig-related and maybe wiped his hand on his shirt. That's what I think that comes from. Or it could come from Chloe eating something that was pig-related. Maybe like a treat or a chew that's got pig DNA in it. But no, you are completely wrong. Completely wrong. That his arm did not have any dog DNA on it. We don't know what DNA his arm had because it wasn't swabbed. Dog eats pig ears and only transfers pig DNA. The reason why I think that's less likely that the pig DNA came from a dog treat is for that very reason. I think the pig DNA comes from John eating something pig related and wiping his hand on his shirt. How do you think some pieces of tail light were in his claws? I think because Proctor had possession of the clothes and also Proctor had possession of the tail light. Or from a crooked cop touching his shirt. Yeah. Could have been a crooked cop or anybody touching John O'Keefe's shirt who had recently eaten some pig-related thing.
Actually a bruise. It's blood that's coming out from a blood vessel. It's a blood vessel that has been broken in some way, and now there's blood coming out.
And are you also familiar with another term, part of that term, known as a punctate contusion?
Yes, so punctate is essentially just a way to describe the size of a contusion. When I say punctate, I mean something that's very, very tiny, almost just like a dot.
And with respect to punctate contusion, what, if anything, did you observe in Mr. O'Keefe's brain, and where was it located?
So there were punctate contusions in the frontal and temporal cortices. So frontal, once again, is the front portion right here. Temporal is kind of right behind it in this area. And the cortex is the gray matter of the brain. So it's a thin strip that kind of just goes around the brain. And then the white matter is underneath all that. So in traumatic injuries, you can see punctate contusions or even larger contusions in the cortex.
Wasn't there testimony that the shirt was in the same bag as the broken taillight pieces at some stage? What the person from the forensic lab said was that when she took the clothes out, she shook the bag and things fell out, debris fell out. I don't know that taillight pieces were in the same bag, but I think Proctor either purposefully or accidentally contaminated those claws. Basically, you can't take anything that Proctor had his hands on as evidence because you just can't trust the guy. The investigation was terrible. You can't trust the findings. Poke scratchings, yeah, possibly.
It usually indicates that the brain has been pushed against something, which is now causing these little blood vessels to rupture, hence seeing the contusions because the blood is no longer contained in the blood vessels.
Now, doctor, with regard to the subarachnoid hemorrhage, is there anything that you're able to do as far as measuring that?
It's hard to measure because it's usually pretty vague. It's not usually something that is a well circumscribed, meaning I could say it starts here and ends here. A lot of times with subarachnoid hemorrhage, because it's sitting in this space that it's not supposed to be in, it can spread. So it may be thicker in one area, thinner in another. So you may have some that may appear just as a very faint hemorrhage, and then some that might be very thick, which you can physically measure. So I usually just give an area where it is and say it's here, it's there, because it's almost like measuring something that has blurred edges. You can't really get a completely accurate measurement.
And what, if anything, were you able to observe or measure with regard to the subarachnoid hemorrhage in the area of the left prefrontal lobe?
So it appeared thicker in that area, meaning that as opposed to it looking just like a faint red color that should not be that color, it was actually thick enough that it was obscuring the underlying brain parenchyma.
If I could turn your attention, doctor, just back for a moment to the punctate contusions that you were testifying about before. As far as your observations of those, was that one or more than one, or how many did you observe?
So there were multiple. There were multiple contusions to the point where it's not something that you can count. I mean, you could count it, but it would probably take a very long time. If it had been something like one or
like bacon or an appetizer with bacon. Yeah, bacon, anything with pig DNA on it. So bacon, pork scratchings. Yeah. And you just wipe your hand on your shirt. Or somebody who'd recently eaten bacon or pork puts their hands on his shirt. So, yeah. That's how I think the pig DNA got on John O'Keefe's shirt. Either from himself or from someone else touching his shirt with pig DNA on their hands. Is it possible it came from a dog treat? Yes. However, I think if there was pig DNA in the dog's mouth that was picked up by swabbing, I think there would also be dog DNA there as well. So I think it's unlikely that pig DNA was transferred by Chloe. I think it's more likely the pig DNA was transferred by John or someone else. like a person who'd recently eaten pig. So there you go. That's just my view.
Or 2, 3, 4, maybe a handful, it would probably be something I would say there are 3 here, 4 there, but there were so many that it didn't serve a purpose to count.
And the number of those, what if any significance does that have in regard to your analysis, your observations, or your opinion?
So given that there's multiple, it means that there's enough pressure in the brain that there were many surfaces that were pressing on the bony prominences of the skull, which was leading to a lot of blood vessels rupturing, causing these contusions.
Now, I think you've talked a little bit, but just in general terms, if you could describe for the jury, what is a hemorrhage?
So a hemorrhage is essentially blood that's coming out from a vessel. So it's like a bruise. Hemorrhage, bruise, contusion, they're fairly similar. Some people use them interchangeably, but it's essentially blood that's no longer contained in a blood vessel.
When something is termed medically, based on your training experience, as a diffuse hemorrhage, what does that mean?
So diffuse means it's over a very large area. It's not something that's just a tiny little area. You could say, okay, I'm looking at this person's, let's say, liver, and there's a 2 by 2 centimeter hemorrhage sitting right there in the right lobe of the liver. Diffuse would mean there's hemorrhage throughout nearly the entirety of the liver.
Now, with regard.
So this really was a catastrophic injury. There is no way he could have survived that injury. Even if he was taken to hospital straight away, there was a very, very high chance that he would have died anyway. So whatever happened, whoever left him dying, I don't think could have saved his life, even if they got medical intervention very quickly. I mean, look, miracles do happen in hospitals occasionally. So maybe there would have been a small chance that he would have survived, but it really was a catastrophic injury. But if that injury had been caused by him being struck by a vehicle to cause an injury so catastrophic to his head, you would have expected way more damage to at least one other part of his body, because the bites and scratches on his right arm really were very superficial. Like, they weren't deep at all. They were nips. They weren't really bites, they were nips of a dog that doesn't like you, not a dog that wants to kill you, not a dog that wants to absolutely savage you, but those kind of nips are from a dog who's probably nervous, scared, rather than really aggressive. So Karen Reid left him. Well, Karen Reid would have had to have injured him to leave him. And don't see any evidence of that, honestly. And neither did the experts. Okay, neither did they.
You made a note as far as there being a diffuse hemorrhage within the pons, P-O-N-S, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury sort of what that means and where is that located within the brain?
So the pons is part of the brainstem. So the brainstem starts right in the middle of the brain, and you have the midbrain, the pons, the medulla, and then it turns into the spinal cord. So the pons is kind of in the middle of the brainstem. And when you have hemorrhage in the pons, in this circumstance, it was because there was the herniation of those inside, which began moving closer and closer towards the pons, pressing on it, causing hemorrhage, because now the tissue is compressed. The blood is not going to be able to flow in and out freely, therefore hemorrhage.
Now, with regard to the totality of what you reviewed in this case in regard to Mr. O'Keefe, would you form any opinions to a reasonable degree of medical certainty in regard to the injuries that you observed to Mr. O'Keefe's brain?
I was able to determine that these are acute traumatic injuries. I know that based on what I observed and in combination with the autopsy findings, that this is due to some type of trauma.
If I could ask, as far as you have certain findings as far as an intraventricular hemorrhage and occipital horns of the lateral ventricles, correct?
Yes.
If you could please explain to the jury what exactly does that mean?
Yes. So the ventricles are almost like a tunnel system of the brain in which the cerebral spinal fluid flows through. So the cerebral spinal fluid serves as a fluid that nourishes the brain. It provides a flow of nutrients, oxygen, things like that. And it starts in the frontal portion of the brain, and then it goes backwards towards the occipital, which is the back. And it also flows downward through the brainstem and then into the spinal cord as well. So the occipital horns of the lateral ventricles are in the back of the head, and having hemorrhage in those areas, in any area of the ventricular system, is usually indicative of some type of trauma. So there should not be blood freely flowing within the ventricular system.
Now, Dr. Stonebridge, with regard to your findings, you mentioned that your findings were that the injuries were acute and that the injuries were the result of trauma, correct?
Yes.
What, if anything, can you say or can you opine as to the mechanism for those acute traumatic injuries?
It was something that required some type of force, given that there were skull fractures. I can't say what type of force or how much force, but it was definitely something that caused some type of force, which led to the skull fractures and then the subsequent brain findings.
And the brain findings in particular that you made, were those consistent with the fall?
They can be, yes.
Can they also be consistent with being struck by a vehicle and then going to the ground?
Yes, they can be.
Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions.
You're welcome.
See, there's nothing devastating there to the Commonwealth's case. So she said that the very last words that she said was, the things that the jury is going to remember, is the force, like the force of a fall, could have been caused by being hit by a motor vehicle. The reason why we know he wasn't hit by a motor vehicle to create the fall is because he had absolutely no other injuries on his body that was at all consistent with being hit by a motor vehicle. That amount of force that was needed to create a catastrophic head injury, if that had been caused by a motor vehicle, there would have been at least bruising on his body. There would have been broken bones in his arm if he'd been sideswiped by a motor vehicle. But no. So whatever caused that fall was not a motor vehicle. But that's the very last thing that she said. Yeah, he could have fallen because he was hit by a motor vehicle. She only looked at his brain. She didn't look at anything else in the rest of his body. So she doesn't know whether he had any other, catastrophic injuries to his body. She was only concerned with his brain. So there's nothing bad for the Commonwealth here. So I'm not really sure why Hank called the other guy and not her. Then we've got the defense.
Cross-examination.
Questions. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Doctor, thank you very much. You are all set.
Thank you.
No questions. So they obviously thought that the testimony wasn't damaging to their case. So interesting, informative, but they didn't think that there was anything that they could ask that would have benefited their case. Very similar to Robert Alessi's stance towards Dr. Wolfe. Didn't ask many questions at all, didn't really get into anything at all. So it's a good strategy, because then you leave it to your own case to show what you think happened. The Golden Boy Wolf with Arca said the tap on John's car could not have caused that taillight damage. One theory that Arca had was that it was actually the drinking glass that caused the taillight to crack. and lose some pieces. So they did experiments with drinking glasses, firing them at a tail light and seeing what speed you would need that glass to be traveling at. So let's say if John threw the glass at the car, let's say he got out of the car angry and threw his glass as she was driving away, what speed would that glass have to be traveling at to smash the tail light? And they said 37 miles an hour would be enough to crack the tail light. That's what Arca said. I'm more interested, though, in Rentschler's testimony than Wolf. Rentschler was the one who testified about the injuries to John's body. In fact, I'll come back tomorrow and we'll listen to Dr. Rentschler's testimony from trial 1 together. Because Dr. Rentschler, what's his title? Like biomechanics and whatever. He explained really well why John was not hit by a motor vehicle based on the injuries John had. Biomechanical engineer, thank you. So that I'll do that tomorrow, because there's no trial tomorrow. No trial tomorrow. Trial isn't beginning again until Tuesday. So, yeah, let's listen to Dr. Rentschler together tomorrow. Let's do that. Let's do that. All right. So, thank you for joining me. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to be live later over on Michelle After Dark in about 2 hours. I've not put the scheduler up yet, but I will. Talking about Jack and Lily Sullivan. It occurs to me that I've been answering a lot of questions in my comments, and I've never actually done a live stream on Jack and Lily. Like, all of my content on Jack and Lily has been recorded videos. So I'm going to do a live stream to answer as many questions as I possibly can about that case. So I'll do that about 3 p.m. my time. So in about 2 hours, 3 p.m. will be 10 a.m. Eastern, and then whatever that is in your local time. All right, guys. So until then, thank you for joining me. Thank you, as always, to the mods. And I shall see you on this channel tomorrow, going through Dr. Rentschler's testimony. Bye, guys. Bye-bye.